Hello, welcome to Nelda Live. My guest today is author and professor Dr. Benjamin Bergen. Benjamin, welcome to Nelda Live.
Thank you so much.
We're so glad to have you here. You are a professor of cognitive science. Could you describe that to us exactly?
Well, cognitive science is the scientific study of the mind, how the brain produces it, how it relates to the body, how minds differ across humans over time and over culture, minds in other species. And my particular corner of cognitive science is language. I like to study what it is about our brains that gives us uniquely in the universe the capacity to do what you and I are doing right now, which is to communicate with words and express ideas about absolutely anything, and learn that how it changes over our lifespans and so on. That's what I do.
That is so fascinating. Now, so recently you've been focusing some of your research on profanity. What made you decide to study that?
Well, I love to how people convey meaning, and it occurred to me at some point as I was studying, the sort of normal, boring, routine ways that we communicate, that there's actually this other channel that we use to express particular kinds of meaning, really emotionally powerful sorts of meaning, the sorts of things um, that we want to express urgently, where we want another person to understand immediately how we feel, and maybe we want to invoke emotional reaction in them. And obviously that's taboo language. And so I started to dig a little bit into the science, what we know about profane language, and it turns out that there's actually a secret science profanity that people don't really teach about in psychology classes and linguistics classes. But it's there, and people have been studying it for a long time. And I started to dive into that a little bit as well, to figure out what is it that makes certain words so powerful, special, and so scary.
So, what is profanity? I mean, how do we describe that? I guess in our society, our culture, or the many cultures, is really right.
Well, yeah, and it differs across cultures, but for our purposes, profanity is language that is agreed upon by a cultural group to be inappropriate in certain contexts, and mostly those are like formal contexts. So they're words that you wouldn't say in church or in kindergarten, or places where children might be around, where you want to present a sort of formal version of yourself. Oftentimes in cultures, people agree that these words are not just taboo, but bad, that there's something intrinsically harmful or damaging or immoral about those words. And that's a belief that gets transmitted from generation to generation. Children are told you can't say these words, or don't say these words, or mommy didn't mean to say that word. Kids can be punished for saying the words. They'll be bleeped out from radio and from television. So a culture decides this is the set of words that we to ban because they're too powerful, too bad.
So, has profanity always been around?
Well, we don't know. We have the best records, mostly the last 20, 30 years, where, uh, the advent of modern computing, we have a record of pretty much everything that's been written. And we have some records from some languages going back 100, 200, 500, couple thousand years, but we don't really know. We do know that at least in Judeo-Christian tradition, there has been this idea that certain words are bad for thousands of years. And historically, in our tradition, that comes from the belief that certain words are sacrilegious if used in the wrong context. So it comes from religious words, and there are lots of practices surrounding not saying religious words in non-religious ways. So taking the Lord's name in vain and that sort of thing. So for at least several thousand years in the West, that's been a tradition. In other cultures, far less so.
So, in determining what if bad words are bad, if we will, does context play a role in that?
Well, there are a number of things that go into determining whether the words are. It's definitely true that people use context, but there are differences in profane words as to how much context matters. So, F word, for example, if you're say, a golf commentator, you can talk about balls all you want, golf balls, that is.
Right.
Uh, but but maybe not on a children's show. Would you be talking about another way that might be judged profanity and inappropriate? Actually depends. The strongest of the words that we have, the most profane words, are ones that you just can't use in any context that we agree upon in general. But yes, context can matter for the remainder of the words.
So, in your book, What the F, which is that your latest book, by the way?
It is. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. So, in What the F, you say that profanity falls into four categories. Could you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when you look across cultures, across time, words tend to come from one of four categories of human experience. They tend to revolve around religion, as we just talked about. They tend to come from sex, language about sex, bodily organs related to sex. Um, Third, other bodily functions, secretion, micturition, kind of stuff, vomiting, menstruation, and then the fourth category is labels for other groups of people, and this has a long history. Times we see them nowadays as slurs, but in many cultures across time, there have been derogatory terms for other groups of people that then rise to the level of words that you wouldn't want to say in informal situations.
So, are the categories pretty much across all countries?
Yeah, in most languages, that's where the profanity is going to come from, and there may be a slightly different balance in every language's profanity portfolio. So in English, we have a very heavy weighting towards sex-related language. That over the course of the 20th century became the uh, powerful and free kind of profane language that we have. But in other languages, it may be different. So in Quebecois, French spoken north of the border, the strongest words are religious terms, and not the ones that you think. They're things like a tabernacle, chalice, that they're the equivalent of the F word for French Canadians. Um, so yeah, it differs very much. In some cases, religious terminology; in other cases, sex, bodily functions. There are even some languages, cultures where other words sort of creep in and become profane, although it's not as frequent. Words related to death and disease, for example, in Dutch, very profanity is just drawn from the names of diseases. So tuberculosis, cancer, they're very strong profane words, which we don't really have. In some other cultures, it can be language about animals. We have that a little bit in English with the B word, for example, but in other cultures and languages, in Chinese, for example, there is a lot more use of animal language in a profane way. But yeah, in general, across the languages of the world, you get those four main categories typically.
So, do we consider offensive? What is offensive? Does it change over time?
Definitely does. Both the particular words and the ways of speaking. So we talked about the F word as being one of the strongest words of the last 100 years, but it wasn't always in Shakespeare's time. There would have been another word, swive, which would have been the equivalent, and the F word was just another word that wasn't particularly offensive. In fact, there are now reports that as early as the 14th century, there were people who had names that included the F word in them, and names that included the C word, and in England, and these words just weren't offensive. They were, I mean, I think you can think of equivalents like screw. Screw is not
Uh huh.
profane.
Yeah.
It's a word that you can that you can use, or crap. You know that it's there's maybe someone who's going to be a little offended, and but you're not going to have terrible scruples about using it in public. I think it's been similar for many of our most offensive words now. And very similarly, the strongest words eventually may phase out. So no one it takes offense nowadays if you say zounds or gadzooks. Um, but it wasn't always the case. Those were because they had sort of religious connotations back in previous centuries. Those were quite strong words, and they aren't anymore. And we can even see this happening in real time. So my generation, so I'm in my 40s, my generation came up using the word suck like that sucks, as just a sort of general derogatory term, it means that's bad. And my parents they could not stand hearing me say that word, because for them it was a very offensive word, because the sucks had a very particular connotation. And my generation grew up knowing that there was that connotation, but not really being offended by it. And my kids will grow up thinking that it's as inoffensive as groovy or weirdo or, whatever. It's not going to be
Right.
know that it was ever offensive to anyone. And that continues to happen now. So words that we think are offensive, that my generation thinks are offensive, Gen Xers, will not be offensive in 20 or 40 years. The F word, for example, I survey my incoming freshmen every year, about 100 of them. They respond, they rate a bunch of words, how profane they find them. The F word is number 22. And you wouldn't expect that, I think, if you're coming from my generational perspective. But as we go, in 50, 100 years, it will have fallen by the wayside. It'll be crap or darn.
Right. It's just so funny because I was thinking my mother is 86 and I showed her the book, but yet my 12-year-old was reading the book and your book. And she was like, that's just ugly, which is such a sweet Southern mama way to say it. Right.
Well, but that's right. I mean, people are a product of their childhood. It's the words that you are exposed to early on that have those very powerful emotional associations. That there's nothing that a little soap in your mouth won't convince you is morally reprehensible, and as a consequence, you carry those with you for your entire life. You can be told 1,000 times that, well, nowadays people don't really find that word particularly off-putting. It's still going to get you right here. You're still going to have that release of adrenaline. You're still going to have that increase in heart rate, that increase in blood pressure, all of these sort of physiological responses that people have to profanity. You're still going to have all of that.
So that's interesting. So those are the responses. They're physiological.
Yeah, so
Wow.
we can measure in the lab. We can do experiments. The undergraduates experiments, actually, compared to the other ones they could be doing. Yeah, they come in and present them with words. They could just sitting there looking at words on a screen or listening to words over headphones, and it's dog, cat, automobile, and then and we can measure the change in their physiological reaction, and a whole suite of things. Their pupils dilate. As I said, blood pressure increases, heart rate increases. We see direct effect adrenaline, blood flow to extremities. Their vision narrows. It's this whole constellation of things that are known as the fight or flight response, and
Wow.
this is something that the body, when it perceives a threat, and you would want, when you perceive a threat, to be able to act as quickly as possible. So you want to have blood in your muscles, in your legs and arms. You would want to be able to see very acutely in a narrow range of vision, so that you can detect the thing that's causing the threat. This system just gets what's the word I'm looking for? It gets locked into, and people react in these very strong ways, and the response is predictable across people. As long as it's a word that person thinks is profane, they will have that reaction.
Isn't that interesting? We also use we use our profanity though in all kinds of ways, right? Not just in offensive ways. To express excitement or love or emphasis. We use it a lot for emphasis, don't we? I mean, there are many uses for these words.
That's exactly right. Of course, there are. I think when we think about profanity, stereotypically, we assume that it's about expressing anger or pain or other negative emotions, and it certainly can be. I mean, I'm as big a culprit as any. I'm cleaning the kids go to bed, and I step on something sharp and painful on their feet, and yeah, I am expressing my feelings very clearly. But when you actually do surveys, watch people using language in real time, you find that they're not necessarily using ways that you predict. In fact, is of children using profanity, and so this is research that's been done by Tim Jay and his colleagues the University of Massachusetts. They just go out kids on playgrounds in schools and that kind of thing, and just ask profanity for, and it's a very minority of the time they're using it for anger or aggression. The of the time is to increase social bonds, right? To shape, look how fun I am, look how creative I am, look how much of a am, look how strongly about this be something very positive. I really loved this movie. I really love your shoes, or whatever it is. They serve this purpose of intensifying the emotional connection that you have to someone, and intensifying the emotional message that you're conveying about whatever it is that's the topic under discussion.
It's interesting because I find that true in my world, because I think I am pretty silent when I get hurt, but I am love using the words for fun, to be funny, just to be humorous or whatever. And that's true in my world, for me anyway. But
Well,
so
I heard an interview with Jerry Seinfeld, who said, he doesn't swear when he does his act at all. He doesn't swear at all, and that was a deliberate choice that he made early on when he discovered that it was too easy if he worked blue. So if he used profanity, then he became lazy. He didn't work on his jokes as much because it was like it was a get out of jail free card, and he decided that he just didn't want to use that trampoline to do it the right way. So I think that's exactly right. There, you have the power to use these words for all sorts of social effect, for comedic effect in others.
but you said in your book, I remember your research said that Japan is the exception to all this. They don't have profanity at all. How in the world is that possible?
Well, that's right. Historically, there's no class of words like we have a class of words. George Carlin did a whole routine that got him banned from radio and got sent to the Supreme Court, just describing like these are the words, right? These are the bad words that you can't say on television. And we have the motion picture, the MPAA. We've got the FCC that have these of words that are just the bad words, and it doesn't matter the context that they're just bad words, and that doesn't exist in Japan, at least not historically. The idea of bleeping television or radio or movies would just be impossible to them until relatively recently. So it's true that there's been more Western influence on Japan. They've things like bleeping in the last decade or two. They now have the middle finger too, which they didn't have before. And so we've been obviously a very good influence on them. But
Yeah, we've been a good influence.
but that's right. I mean, if you stubbed your toe and you wanted to say really strong in Japan, you would say, "What a fool I am." And those words would express strong emotions. I mean, in the context, you could say them in a really emotive way with a lot of intensity, and people would understand, yes, you are experiencing strong pain. This is a frustrating situation for you. Those same words, bak or whatever, wouldn't be something that you would avoid saying around your grandmother or your priest or anything like that, your 5-year-old.
Yeah, because some words are considered profane, others aren't. We can say poo, shit, crap, but they all have different effects. So, what is the rhyme and reason is in that?
Yeah. Well, so part of the story is that determining what specific word becomes profane in a language is actually not it's not entirely predictable. So we can identify the factors that go. So we say, well, it helps if it comes from one of these categories of experience, one of these taboo types of experience, things that people don't like talking about. They're concepts that have taboos around them, and so they lend those taboos to the words, to some of the words that relate to those meanings. Another thing that we can say is that it matters, at least in English, how the word sounds. So it's true that there are certain words in English that sound more like what our profanity sounds like than others do. In English, it just so happens that a large proportion of our profanity is made up of short words, like one syllable long, that have lots of consonants, especially consonants at the end, and especially multiple consonants at the end. And you can kind of think about what words I might be talking about. But you just mentioned shit. Shit is a great example of that. And so it sounds kind of like a profane word. Other words that you could use for the same thing, like poo or defecation, don't sound like that, right? Either they don't have the right number of syllables, or they don't have the consonants at the end. And so the sound of the words goes into, at least for English speakers, part of how we judge that word. So that's another factor that's what the word is going to be like. But it's kind of like, how can you tell whether an actor is going to be a star? Well, you can say what the factors are going to be, right? Does he have the right look? Does he have the talent? Does he have the drive? But it's also a crapshoot. And I think it's kind of like that with profane words. We can say, what are the factors that make these words more likely to be profane? And as you point out, some words that relate to defecation, to sex, and so on, some of them are completely acceptable. They are the words that you would use around children. Okay, maybe, poo, maybe that's the word that you use with kids.
Right.
And others are words that you would use with your physician. You might talk about passing stool or something like that. Those are words that come from the right domain of human experience, but they're targeted to different kind of registers of formality. This is a word that I use around kids. This is a word that I use in a medical setting. And yeah, as we know, it's we can, as many of the social sciences, we can come up with what the factors are and come up with a statistical prediction, but we can't actually determine which one with certainty, which one won't.
So there's a term that you used in What the F. It's called linguistic whack-a-mole. Could you explain what that is?
That's right. So we have this idea that the way, especially as parents and educators, and sometimes as policymakers too, we have this idea that the problem with profanity is just that people are using it so much. And if there was some way we could stop people from using it, we could suppress it somehow, then it'll go away. And so that's what we do. As parents, we hear children say words that we don't like, and we say, don't say that, or we punish them. And the same thing happens in schools, and the same thing happens in terms of censorship, right? Words get bleeped out of TV shows, or movies fight to get lower ratings by excising all of the offending profanity out of them. And so we try to censor or ban our way out of there being profanity. The problem is, of course, that what's kind of a twofold problem, the whack-a-mole problem. There's sort of two bits to it. The first is that just telling people not to use the language, not only doesn't that make them stop using it, but actually it shows them how powerful the language is and makes them want to use it even more. And second, even if you're effective at making sure that in certain circumstances people can't use certain words, people are going to just come up with new profane vocabulary that's going to skirt the entire situation. So
precisely,
if you've watched Stephen Colbert, for example, back when he was on cable television, he was inventing new words all the time that weren't profane when he started, but certainly got there eventually, but that no one would think of censoring. And this is the nature of how generations define themselves through their language. Children, especially adolescents, they want to talk in ways that are defining for their social group, for their generational group, and that distinguish them from those generations that precede. And so the ways that their parents want them not to talk, they will talk. And the things that their parents find offensive, they might not themselves find offensive. They might use completely different vocabulary to get around it, to find ways to skirt the letter of the law. And so the idea of just banning profanity, it's not just ineffectual, but it's also counterproductive, because it produces the urgency and the value to those words in the first place. And that's kind of where the idea of whack-a-mole comes from.
I could see that. That's absolutely true. I think when we ban something, people are drawn to it like a magnet.
We know this from abstinence-only education. I don't know if you want to get into this, but in states where you implement abstinence-only education in schools, there's this remarkable effect, which is that teen pregnancies go up, and
Wow.
it's this it's this problem where if you tell, especially adolescents, don't do this thing, then there is nothing else that they want to do more than that thing. And it's very much like that with profanity.
Yeah, it's like when I tell my girls, do not take the devices upstairs. It's bedtime. But, I inevitably find them with their devices upstairs, so we can't break the rules, right? Does profanity follow the grammar rules?
Interestingly, it kind of does and it kind of doesn't. There are specific ways of using profanity that don't look like anything else in the language. Um, Now, we're going to have to actually say the words to get into this.
Let's say the words. Let's go. Let's go for it. Okay, go ahead.
So there's this thing about English, and in principle, every language on earth, that they have to have subjects in their sentences. You have to have a subject. So in the sentence, John loves Mary. John is the subject. Mary is the object. You have to have a subject, and you can kind of get away with it if you have a special thing called an imperative sentence, which is, pick that up for me. You're not actually saying who the subject is, but you know who's doing the picking up. It's you, the person being addressed. Okay. But profanity breaks that rule. And the sort of most obvious example is fuck you. So the question is, what is the subject of fuck you? You might say, well, it's you. It's right there. But the problem is that the verb fuck takes a subject who is the one doing the fucking, whereas you are definitely not in that special position in fuck you. So then who is it? Well, it's not me. It's not some third person. And people have sort of tried to find different solutions for this. Like, who could be the subject of fuck you? But it turns out that, I won't get into all the nitty gritty detail of the grammar of this thing, but it turns out that there's no subject. And there's no subject in damn you either. And there's no subject in screw you. And so this is a whole class of expressions, things that people say that look a lot like sentences, but for whatever reason, they just don't have a subject. And this is a really weird thing. So like, imagine if if you're a biologist and you discovered a whole new class of organism that has cells with no nucleus in them. All cells have nuclei. That's just the nature of a cell. But now all of a sudden, wait, these cells don't have nuclei. It would be kind of like that for people who study language. It's like, can you have such a thing? And it turns out that you can. And there are a variety of other examples of how profanity kind of follows the rules, but only up to a point. And that suggests that it's maybe a different system for communicating. Maybe it follows a different set of rules. It's learned in a different way, and maybe it uses different resources in the brain.
So, in our society, let's talk about the rules here, societal rules, when it's okay to curse and when it's not. What are in our society, let's say, what are our rules?
Yeah. Well, if I knew that, I could just write them down, and that would be a good book. It's very complicated. It depends heavily on both individual and organizational expectations. So, I talk to people all the time who tell me that, well, in my workplace, people swear all the time. This is, people, anything, realtors, people, car mechanics, people who work in restaurants. Yeah, we swear all the time. Some people will tell me, and other people will tell me, no, we don't swear at all. So there's like an organizational setting where some organizations are profanity friendly and others are not. Now, obviously, you can kind of make predictions. So you can say, well, it's probably the case that people who are in very high pressure situations that are sort of closed communities, it's not open to the house. It's just us in the back room, where it's a very informal kind of action. People spend long hours together, Wolf Street kind of scenarios. You can imagine, yeah, that's probably a situation where you're likely to get a lot of profanity. Merchant Marines, that sort of thing. But and you could predict that probably if you work in a covent, then you're probably less likely to experience profanity in your workplace or in a kindergarten. So to start with, it kind of depends on what the social setting is. the settings where people are most likely to judge profanity to be more acceptable are ones where people know each other very well, where they're all adults or of the same age range, oftentimes when they're of the same gender identity. So people swear more in single sex environments. Both men and women swear more in single sex environments than they do in mixed environments. Um, Although men still statistically swear more in mixed sex environments than women do on average. Um, it depends on on the face that you're trying to present. So how much of what I'm doing in this social setting is interacting with strangers and trying to demonstrate some dimension of my personality to them or my identity to them that would be harmed by swearing. So if you're, let's say you're wait staff in a restaurant, in times when people actually go to restaurants and eat there. I
Yes.
know things are different out here in California, but um, uh, but but in such circumstances, you might want to present a sort of neutral image of yourself. You might not want to reveal that you are the type of person who has the sort of informal, casual swearing, and so you might avoid it. But in other circumstances where you're interacting with strangers, you might very much want to casual and informal and accessible. So for example, if you're a stand-up comic, you might really want people to get on board with you. You might want them to see you as a norm breaker, because maybe your comedy is generally norm breaking comedy, and so the language should follow suit. So so that it's a very complicated calculus of what do I want the reaction of which other people to be. How much of the positive effects, that they'll think I'm maybe in a positive way think that I'm a norm breaker, or maybe in a positive way think that I'm informal, accessible, funny. How much of those do I want to activate, and which of the downsides am I afraid of? Do I want them to think that I'm out of control, or that I don't know the social rules, or that I'm uneducated, or that or that I don't have strong language abilities, or whatever it is that people might have as these associations that they bring to profanity? Where's my comfort zone? Which of those do I think I'm going to get in this environment? So super complicated to answer what
Wow,
are
it
our rules.
is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, if we can, let's go back to children. How are they impacted by profanity?
This is something I care about a lot. I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and uh, we are very concerned about anything that we could do to possibly cause them harm, and of any type, right? So if it were shown, if there were science showing that just swearing around kids, like that, I step on the Tinker toy, and it goes through my foot, and I swear, if it were shown that that could cause harm to children, then that would absolutely be something that we did not do in our house. If it were shown that our swearing made them more likely to swear in public, and that would have negative repercussions for them in school, for example, like they'd be more likely to be on the teacher's bad side or something like that, then we would absolutely be very careful about that. The science here is pretty clear, though, that the main things, that there are basically two things that profanity can play a role in causing harm to children with, and the first is as part of verbal abuse. So it's a tragic fact that children, many of them, experience all kinds of verbal abuse, and that can be insults or threats, and just sort of deprecating them and saying that they're worthless, that sort of thing. But these kinds of ways of using language demonstrably hurt kids in all kinds of ways, increase anxiety, depression. They do worse in school. They have more trouble making friends, and so on. And profanity is often used as part of this sort of verbal abuse of children, and that's tragic. To the extent that we can make verbal abuse and other kinds of abuse stop, that's all to the better. The other way is as part of, when people are using slurs. So there have been a number of longitudinal studies watching what happens to kids in schools over time largely with middle school kids because there's so much kind of social stuff happening in middle school, and asking them how much they are called by slurs, and those could be, sex-based slurs, or um, homophobic slurs, ethnic slurs, that kind of thing. And the science shows that kids who are called more by particularly homophobic slurs in 6th and 7th grade are the ones in 8th grade who have the biggest problems with, again, anxiety, depression, feelings of disconnection, disconnectedness from school, and so on. So what both of those things have in common is that they're really using language to try to harm the child, right? To try to make them feel powerless or weak or bad in some way. The I'm excited, or look at this funny thing that I'm saying, or even just like I'm in pain, I slammed my finger in the door. Those kinds of profanity haven't been shown to cause any negative effect on kids. They not effects on whether they're more likely to say those words, whether they're more likely to experience these sort of negative emotional or cognitive effects. Part of that might be because, at least when it comes to this sort of general purpose swearing, kids aren't really taking their cues so much from adults. They see what the adults are doing, and they understand that these are, strong words that the parents are using, but they don't necessarily, but they can read what the adult is doing emotionally, right? They can also tell, okay, this is just a person in pain, and they're using this word to express that pain, or this is a person who's excited, or excited that their team scored a touchdown, and so this is the word that they use to express excitement. They're able to read the emotion, and so that emotion doesn't have any negative consequence. And when they're coming up with their own profane words that they're going to use with their friends, they're learning that from the older kids on the playground, or from the kids in their class with older siblings, or those are the social connections that form the profanity that they're going to go off and start using. They don't want to talk like mom and dad. Mom and dad suck.
That's good. That's good. So I've heard that some families have swear jars, and it's really for the kids to make the parents pay if the parents swear. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it's cute. I mean, it may affect the parents a bit. I mean, I don't know if it's enough of a disincentive for me to have to throw in a few coins every time I swear. It's certainly what it does is it draws attention to the fact of the swearing. I mean, that's and it sort of makes it not just the attention of the adult, it draws the entire family's attention to it. So this is something we pay attention to. And there's a positive outcome of that. People being aware of the language that you use is the first step to understanding why you use the language that way, understanding the consequences of using that language. I think that that's something that we try to do with our kids, right? So because the science tells us that banning words is not going to work very well, we have these conversations with them, the 6-year-old more than the 2-year-old. Yeah, that word that you used, when I use that word, it's because I'm, really frustrated or angry or excited or happy or whatever it is. What do you think would happen if you used that word at school? And that sort of engendering awareness of the social context, and as we've been talking about, the really complicated social rules surrounding what words, what people will react to when and where, just kind of bringing attention to the language. I think that that's a really valuable thing, and increasing what cognitive scientists call metalinguistic awareness, the awareness of the words that you use and why you use them and how they might differ and how other people might use them differently. That can't help but benefit them in the long term. So I see there being potential benefits to that. But if you think it's just going to keep people from swearing, you would need to set the ante really high to make that work.
So in what way, how do you deal with your kids and profanity? Since this has been something you've been focusing on. So
yeah. So having kids oftentimes for many people has this effect, which is that you are automatically more conscious about the language that you use, because especially when they get to, 6 months, 9 months, a year, and they're starting to react to language, and they're starting to produce some things that sound kind of like words. You start to think, wait a second, I'm using these words around an infant. And so we spontaneously found ourselves just swearing less at home. When you have two adults at home who've known each other for decades, you have a casual environment and swearing's not unheard of. And kids show up and that changes. I think that we have taken a hard line against profanity when the moment is right. If I'm talking to my wife about something that really frustrated me about my workday, that I'm going to talk in a way that expresses that emotion naturally to me, and that feels cathartic to me. I need to work through those feelings too. And we are, like I said, we are very clear with the kids about explaining the contexts of use. And this is something that kids are really good at. We give them far too little credit. Kids can, take a 2-year-old. A 2-year-old can learn where you use the potty and where you don't, right? They learn, okay, so now we're doing potty training. The floor of the living room, not a great place. The bathroom, good. And they can learn about the appropriateness of attire, right? We wear these clothes to church, and we wear these clothes to soccer practice, and we wear these clothes to the pool. They totally get it. We pool, bang, they know which shorts to pull out. And I think that even if the rules are really complicated for adults, for kids, they're actually pretty simple, which is that in environments that are in the comfort of their family and close friends, then profanity is, depends on the family, of course. Profanity overall is going to be more tolerated than it is as soon as you go outside of that. So when you go to a place that has other adults, it's probably going to be frowned upon, and they should understand what the consequences will be. So if they use those words, the teacher's not going to like it. Maybe the teacher has a punishment policy for using profanity. Maybe a stranger, if they use the word in the store, is going to turn around and harumph and clutch their pearls, or maybe say something to mommy or daddy. And that is something that they can learn to understand quite quickly. And so by the age of 6, I think most kids have that awareness of context. They know when they feel comfortable and at home and with family, and they know when they're out in the world. And it's pretty straightforward for them to understand the consequences of language use in those different circumstances. So that's really what we do, is we try to be ourselves, and to try to interpret these invisible rules about the social expectations on the child and what the consequences are for different sorts of behaviors. We try to talk them through that and expose the hidden connective tissue of social expectations.
That's a really good way to handle it. I like that.
It's a way. Well, I'll report back when they're 20. We'll see. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't.
As with all parenting.
Yes.
There are actually some health benefits to profanity. Would you tell us a little bit about those?
There's been some really interesting research coming out of Richard Stevens' lab in the UK. And he wanted to ask exactly that. What happens when you swear? Does it make you, does it help in any way? And the first study that he reported that got a lot of traction and has replicated and seems to be a real thing, is that is a finding showing that people actually are able to tolerate pain better when they're swearing. Now, this doesn't maybe come as too much of a surprise, because when we're in pain, one of the first things we want to do is swear. But the question is, does it actually help? And so the way that he asked this was he had undergraduates come into the lab. This study is a little bit less fun than the ones we run in my lab. and he had them stick their hand in nearly freezing water, a bucket of water. And the task is just hold it there as long as you can, and then say how much it hurt. And he had them in 2 groups. Half of them were told, say a swear word over and over, and the other half were told to say some other neutral word over and over. And it turns out that the swearers, the ones who were randomly assigned to swear, could hold their hands in about 50% longer than the non-swearers, and reported significantly less pain. And as I said, this happens for men, this happens for women. they did a follow-up study, and it was actually quite fascinating, where they did the same thing, but then they asked people afterwards, so by the way, how much do you swear in your everyday life? And it turned out that the people who rarely swear, who report never or only infrequently swearing, showed the largest benefit from swearing in the experiment. They were the ones who, when they swore, could hold their hand. And
Wow.
the people who swear a lot, or at least were swearing a lot in their everyday lives, gained relatively little benefit from swearing. So it's almost as if they had sort of used up the power, fight or flight response effect that profanity can have, so that it was less when they actually did need to use it. And that's because it's the fight or flight reaction that's actually producing this ability to tolerate pain.
So that's what's going on in the brain.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the release of adrenaline. So you have this ability. That's part of what the fight or flight response is, right? You
Right.
want to be, clawed by a bear and still be okay with it, right? Still be able to run away. And so yeah, or you want to be able to run really, really fast and not have your sore muscles make you slow down. So this ability to tolerate pain is part and parcel of that same physiological reaction that the body has.
Okay, so I understood when I was actually listening to your book on what the F on audio but it I understood that if you were receiving, let's say, being cussed out, that you had those. I didn't realize that when you're actually saying them that you have that same
Yeah, you do. And
going on.
we think that it's because of a perceived social threat. So the fact that these words are so taboo makes it so that when you say that word, to look around, okay, who did I say that around? It's behind me. And so you elevate your arousal,
Wow.
release of adrenaline, all that stuff, along with all the sort of core emotional association. So when you are experiencing strong emotions, you use this word as part of the circuit, part of what you're doing in that situation, and that is also likely to release the adrenaline.
So I see why you have gotten so fascinated by studying this. It's fascinating stuff. So, what about your prediction for profanity in the future? Do you think some words will be more or less offensive, or what? How does our culture move? I guess with that in the future.
Well, we're tracking this right now. So like I said, I take a poll of bias sample. There are 100 undergraduates at UC San Diego, so they're from California. They're mostly from Southern California. They're of a certain age and so on. But but among them, there's a very clear trend, which is that almost all profanity is becoming less offensive to them. Your F words, your lots of the words. I don't have I
Yeah.
don't have letters for all the words, but the sort of the Carlin level profanity, the words that relate to sex and bodily functions and religion as well for this particular group, are becoming less offensive over time. And you can kind of understand why that would be the case. If you've been on social media, that they're being bombarded with it. And the same is true with the democratization of television and radio. Podcasts aren't censored in the same way that broadcast radio is. Satellite
Right.
radio, cable, all sorts of different ways that people get media, YouTube, that are totally uncensored, and so are using a lot more profanity. And the consequence is kind of what you see with people who use a lot of profanity and then stick their hand in a bucket of ice water. There's less of a physiological reaction to the word, and over time they just think that it's less offensive. Now, the exception is for slurs. So current Gen Zers, which are the students that I see when they're fresh young adults, view slurs as the most profane, most offensive words in the language. And the top 10 words that they list are all words that are used to denigrate people based on sex, sexual orientation, race, religion, and so on. Ableness as well. And so to the extent that they are the generation that are forming their beliefs about language right now and are going to carry those beliefs forward for the next hopefully 60, 80 years, as the people who are making rules and kids and telling their kids what to do and so on. The future is that this generation is going to have very strong negative reactions to slurs in particular. So
Mm.
they have a new F word, and that F word is a derogatory term for homosexual men, and it's a word that I am a little bit ashamed to admit I used to use on the playground when I was a kid, because it was a word that we just bandied about. It just meant bad or weak or something. We didn't know that it had anything to do with
Right.
homosexuality, maybe. Um, and and it's the third most offensive word, or somewhere in their fifth most offensive word for these young adults, where our F word is number 22. So that's the near future. That And we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what it
Mm.
looks like when these people gain power to the point where they can, which they already are starting to have, where now there are people who are afraid to use these words on social media. These particular words you can't use. So a word that we used on the playground when I was a child, retarded, very offensive to
Oh
Gen
yeah.
Zers,
Hmm.
and to the point where you wouldn't, if you were a movie star or an athlete, you wouldn't use that word
Right.
for fear of being canceled, right? For fear of millions of people deciding, okay, I'm not a fan of you anymore. I'm not. I'm going to unfollow you. I'm not going to
Right.
buy the shoes that you endorse. And that power is only going to grow. And I think it's fascinating. It's a fascinating experiment to watch, where young people of a culture are the ones dictating the terms. So I think we've got a fascinating near future of where profanity is going.
So do you think there'll be less censorship in the US in the future?
I don't see a way that you can have censorship of the sort of profanity of the sex and bodily function related words. I mean, it broadcast television and radio are already occupying such small slices of the media landscape that the only kind of censorship you really have is based on money, right? It's sponsorships. Do the sponsors accept this kind of language? Do
Yeah.
the viewers accept that kind of language? And so I can't envision a future that continues the kind of centralized uh, censorship that we're familiar with from the 20th century. I think the 21st century is really about media enterprises and brands calculating, like, what is the target language for my audience, for
Yeah.
the people that I want to reach. What do they like? What do they want? What do they find offensive? And so I think what you're going to find is a proliferation of variety. I think you're going to find kind of like what you historically have for film. You're gonna have movies that are, R-rated movies that are targeted towards people who want violence and swearing and all kinds of stuff. And you're going to have other movies that are tailored towards people who don't want those things, the sort of Disney class movie. And I think that people are going to sort of self-select what makes them comfortable. So central censorship, I don't think so, but I think extensive mutual calculation of compatible expectations about what profanity people want to hear and and what they don't want to hear.
So do you have a time for a couple of audience questions?
Love to, yeah.
All right, here we go then. All right, we have three of them, I think. So one of them we may have already addressed, I'll see. But let's see. The first one is, where do words like effing or freaking come from, especially when used by kids to get around not saying the real words?
Well, when the rule is about the word, like you can't say this word with these sounds, with these letters. When the rule is about it, when the letter of the law is so specific to a word, then you can express the intent while still maintaining your good graces in light of that rule, right? And one way to do that is what's called a minced oath. And so frickin' and shoot and darn and shucks and shut the front door are all examples of these minced oaths. F word is another good example. You are not saying the word,
Right.
you are identifying the word that you would have said, just like you are with frickin'. You
Yeah.
are you are saying, well, here there is a word that I'm not saying, but I'm trying to express the same uh, feeling. Now, of course, those words don't have anything like the same emotional impact because they're not banned, and so you don't have that gut reaction to frickin' or shoot or whatever. The more effective ones have a little bit of trickery at the very beginning, so they sound similar to that other word starting off. So shut the front door actually does pretty good job of raising people's hackles until they get to the front part. Um, but yeah, but they have they have this character of following the literal letter of the law while still hinting at what you and I both know I mean. And so you named the two main ways that these words are created. One is
Yes.
by an acronym. You just call out the word as the F word, the S word, whatever it is. And the other way is by finding a word that sounds similar. They always start with a similar sound or sequence of sounds.
Okay. Question number 2. You ready? What about giving the finger, which we know is different across cultures? How do gestures relate to verbal profanity?
Yes, profane gestures across cultures, it's the same. So the finger we know is extremely expressive in Western culture. So we know the middle finger goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks would show it to each other to denigrate them. And in ancient Rome, it was digitus impudicus, which is the impudent. So and that's followed us for thousands of years. In other languages and in other cultures, there are ones. There's something called the fig, is the thumb through fingers, and it's unclear exactly what it refers to. But as far as we can tell, there have been ways to demean, to show disrespect for a very long time. Whether those precede language or whether they always come in lockstep with profanity, we just don't know, because there's still record of the gestures themselves. If we have a relatively impoverished record of written language, for example, and almost none of spoken language, basically none of gestures, because there are no videos or pictures from say ancient civilizations, and so we just rely on the record of descriptions of things that people did, and descriptions of actions in plays and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. So the other one that I think is funny, this is just a funny question to me. When you surveyed your students, so you talked about number 22. Can you tell us what number 1 was?
Oh, yeah. So the top couple are always the N word,
Uh-huh.
the C word. This new F word, fag, is often very just to be very offensive, and then other sorts of terms of general
Yeah.
so ethnic or sex or sexual orientation based ones are usually the top ones. Yeah.
Benjamin, thank you so much for being here. Before you go, where can the audience find you? And what are your books that you're? I mean, let's go ahead and promote a little bit here.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah. So what the F, what swearing reveals about our language, our brains, and ourselves is the topic of today's conversation. And I understand that you can in the places that you get books. The audiobook remarkably, the audiobook has been far more successful than the written one. It was a real experience to record it myself, because that was a lot of swearing into a microphone, and a lot more than I'd ever done before. But and then so my first book is Louder Than Words: The New Science of How the Mind Makes Meaning, and that's much more general. There's no profanity in there, but it's kind of about how we manage to communicate using language in general. Those are the two main things.
Okay. And so, do you have a website, someplace that they can find you, or just look for your books?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm totally social media-less. It's a matter of self-preservation. I'm the type of person who would be on it obsessively, and it would cause me a lot of psychological distress. So I can't do that. But yeah, you can find me on the internet. I'm relatively easy to find.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. Really, really a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
It's been so much fun, and thank you for all the great questions.
Oh, yes.